.0000 on the UK time. 07042026. The name of this live is WitchCraft. Intro.
Across history, they've shifted from weird figures in folklore and trials to modern symbols of autonomy and spiritualism. Witches are legendary figures often depicted as practitioners of magic and herbalism. Across history, they have shifted from feared figures in folklore and trials to modern symbols of autonomy and spiritualism. Witches are legendary figures often depicted as practitioners of magic and herbalism. Across history, they have shifted from feared figures in folklore and trials to modern symbols of autonomy and spiritualism. The history of witches is a complex journey from ancient spiritual roles to the mass hysteria of the great witch hunts, and finally to modern reclamation. Ancient origins and cunning folk. Before the medieval period, witches were often referred to as cunning folk or wise ones, from the Anglo-Saxon word wicca, roles. They served their communities as herbalists, midwives, and healers. Legality. In ancient Mesopotamia and Rome, magic itself wasn't always illegal. Only harmful magic, maleficium, intended to damage crops or kill people was prosecuted. Earliest records. One of the first literary mentions is the witch of Endor in the Bible, 1 Samuel, whom King Saul sought out to summon the spirit of a prophet. The Great Witch Hunts, 1450 to 1750. The perception of witches shifted from neighborhood healers to servants of the devil during the early modern period. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1486. This Hammer of Witches was a guidebook written by Heinrich Kramer. It argued that women were more susceptible to the devil due to their frailer nature, and provided a framework for identifying and prosecuting them. The Scale. Between 1400 and 1775, roughly 100,000 people were prosecuted in Europe and colonial America, with 40,000 to 60,000 executions. Key trials. North Berwick, 1590. King James VI of Scotland became obsessed with witches after a storm nearly sank his fleet.
Oh.
He personally participated in the trials. Salem, 1692. Perhaps the most famous, where 19 people were hanged in colonial Massachusetts due to local spectral evidence and mass hysteria. Demographics and stereotypes. While the popular image is an old woman in a pointed hat, the historical reality was more varied. Gender. About 80% of the accused were women, but in places like Iceland and Russia, the majority of those accused were men. The hat and broom, the pointed hat, was likely an exaggeration of 17th century Puritan fashion. The broomstick became a common image in the 15th century, though early illustrations showed witches riding goats or shovels. Ducking/swimming. A common trial where a suspect was tied and thrown into water. If they floated, they were rejected by the water and guilty. If they sank, and often drowned, they were innocent. The shift to modernity. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought a rise in scientific rationalism. Laws were changed to view witchcraft not as a supernatural crime, but as a fraudulent claim. In 1735, Britain passed the Witchcraft Act, which stopped the execution of witches and instead punished those who pretended to have magical powers. If you thought the Eye of Newt was weird, historical records show that the reality of witchcraft was often even more surreal. Here are some of the most bizarre facts from history and folklore. 1. Eye of Newt is just mustard seed. Shakespeare's famous bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble ingredients weren't actually animal parts. Many of those names were botanical code words used by herbalists. Eye of Newt, mustard seeds. Toe of frog, buttercup petals. Tongue of dog, hound stung, a common weed. Wool of bat, moss. 2. The great witch-pricking profession. In the 17th century, a professional class of prickers emerged. They believed that a witch's body had a devil's mark that was insensitive to pain and wouldn't bleed. They used retractable needles, essentially stage props, to prove a suspect didn't bleed when poked, leading to a guilty verdict. 3. The tomato fear. In the 1500s and 1600s, many Europeans believed tomatoes were poisonous or used in black magic. Because tomatoes are part of the nightshade family, which includes toxic plants like belladonna, they were dubbed wolf peaches and rumored to be an ingredient in flying ointments. 4. Witch bottles as protection. To ward off spells, people used to create witch bottles. These were ceramic or glass jugs filled with iron nails, brass pins, hair, and, most bizarrely, human urine. The idea was that the urine would trap the witch's magic, and the nails would cause them physical pain whenever they tried to cast a spell. 5. Why they ride broomsticks. The association with broomsticks likely comes from flying ointments made with hallucinogenic plants like henbane or aconite. These ointments were highly toxic if swallowed, so practitioners applied them to their skin using a wooden staff or broom handle. The resulting trip gave the sensation of flying. 6. The trial of the Benandanti. In 16th century Italy, a group called the Benandanti, good walkers, claimed they were good witches. They told inquisitors that 4 times a year, their spirits would leave their bodies at night to fight evil witches in the fields using fennel stalks. They believed if they won, the harvest would be plentiful. 7. King James I, the expert demonologist. King James I of England, who commissioned the King James Bible, was so terrified of witches that he wrote a book called Demonology. He was convinced a coven of witches had cast a spell to create a storm while he was sailing, and he personally oversaw the torture of suspects in the North Berwick witch trials. The breaking of the wand is one of the most poignant and ancient rituals in British history. It isn't about folklore witches, but rather a high-stakes ceremonial act of the British monarchy that signifies the absolute end of a reign. Here is the story and history behind it. The ritual, the breaking of the stick. At the funeral of a British sovereign, the Lord Chamberlain, the highest-ranking officer of the royal household, steps forward toward the coffin. He takes a thin white staff, his wand of office, and snaps it in two. He then places the broken pieces on top of the casket before it is lowered into the royal vault. The symbolic meaning: the act serves two powerful symbolic purposes. The end of service. It signifies that the Lord Chamberlain's duty to that specific monarch is officially over. The death of the reign. It shows that the authority granted to the household by that king or queen has dissolved. When a new monarch takes the throne, a new Lord Chamberlain is appointed and given a brand new, unbroken wand. Historical origins. The disciplinarian. Historically, the white wand wasn't just for show. In the Middle Ages and Tudor times, the Lord Chamberlain actually used the staff to physically tap rowdy or disrespectful courtiers to keep order in the palace. A rare sight. Because British monarchs often reigned for decades, this ceremony is rarely seen. Before the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, the last time the wand was broken was in 1952 for her father, King George VI. Television history. Queen Elizabeth II's funeral was the first time in history that the breaking of the wand was ever televised. Previously, it was a solemn moment witnessed only by those physically present in the chapel. The witch connection, a common misconception. Though it's called a wand, it has no connection to witchcraft or magic. In royal terminology, a wand is simply a staff of office, similar to a scepter. However, the visual of a high official snapping a wooden rod over a grave often reminds people of the folklore trope where a wizard or witch's power is broken by destruction. Witchcraft is a universal human concept, but its story changes drastically depending on where you look. While Western history often focuses on the witch as a servant of the devil, other cultures view practitioners as essential healers, political advisors, or terrifying neutral forces of nature. 1. Africa, the dual nature of juju and mangu. In many sub-Saharan African cultures, there is a clear distinction between healers and witches. The Azande people, anthropologists famously studied the Azande, Sudan's Congo, who believed witchcraft, mangu, was a physical substance inside a person's body. It could be used unconsciously. If you were jealous of a neighbor, your witchcraft might accidentally ruin their crops. Traditional healers, sangomas. In South Africa, sangomas are highly respected spiritual leaders who use muti, traditional medicine, to heal the living and consult ancestors. They are the antithesis of the night witch who seeks to cause harm. 2. Mesoamerica, the shapeshifters, the Nagual. In Mexican and Central American folklore, the story of witchcraft is tied to Nagualism. The Nagual. It is believed that certain powerful practitioners can transform into animals, usually a jaguar, owl, or dog, to protect their community or spy on enemies. The Lechuza, a specific, darker legend in northern Mexico and Texas, tells of the Lechuza, an old woman who transforms into a giant human-faced owl to take revenge on those who wronged her. 3. Japan, the fox witch, Kitsune Mochi. In Japanese history, witchcraft was often hereditary and tied to animal spirits. Fox owners. Certain families were rumored to be Kitsune Mochi, fox holders. It was believed they kept invisible fox spirits to do their bidding, bringing them wealth or sabotaging rivals. Social stigma. Being a fox-owning family was a serious social curse. In some rural areas, people would refuse to marry into these families for fear that the witchcraft would enter their bloodline. 4. The history of witchcraft trials is a dark chapter of human history, marked by legal systems that prioritized spectral evidence and confessions over physical proof. While the Salem trials are the most famous in the US, the European Great Hunt was far more extensive and organized. 1. The legal framework of a trial. To prosecute a witch, authorities had to move away from standard legal protections. They often treated witchcraft as a crime and exceptum, an exceptional crime, because it was seen as a secret conspiracy with the devil. The accusation usually started with a maleficium, a claim that a neighbor's cow died or a child fell ill due to a curse. The examination, searching for witches' marks, moles, scars, or birthmarks. These were poked with needles. If they didn't bleed or feel pain, it was proof of a pact with the devil. Torture. In many European jurisdictions, torture was legally permitted to extract a confession. Once a person confessed, they were then pressured to name accomplices, leading to a chain reaction of arrests. 2. Major historical trials. Trial/location. Year. Key detail. The Valais Witch Trials, Switzerland. 1428. One of the earliest organized hunts. Over 360 people were killed. The North Berwick Trials, Scotland. 1590. King James VI personally interrogated the accused, believing they raised a storm to sink his ship. The Pendle Witch Trials, England. 1612. A landmark English trial where a 9-year-old girl was allowed to testify against her own family.
Oh.
The Würzburg Trials, Germany. 1626. One of the largest in Europe. Over 200 people of all ages and social classes were burned at the stake. Salem Witch Trials, Massachusetts. 1692. Triggered by fits in young girls. 19 people were hanged and 1 man was pressed to death. 3. The swimming test. Ordeal by water. This was a bizarre legal litmus test, based on the idea that water was a pure element that would reject a witch. The suspect was tied thumb to toe and lowered into a pond. Floating. Guilty. The water rejected them. Sinking. Innocent, but they often risked drowning before being pulled out. 4. The role of the Witchfinder General. In the 1640s, during the chaos of the English Civil War, a man named Matthew Hopkins appointed himself Witchfinder General. He traveled across East Anglia, charging towns huge fees to cleanse them of witches. In just 2 years, he was responsible for more executions than had occurred in the previous century. 5. Why did the trials end? The decline of the trials in the late 17th and 18th centuries happened for several reasons. Scientific revolution. A shift toward rationalism meant judges began to demand physical evidence rather than spectral, ghostly claims. Legal reform. High courts began to realize that confessions under torture were unreliable. Economic cost. The hunts were expensive and socially destabilizing, often draining the resources of the towns that held them. The last legal execution for witchcraft in England took place in 1682, though the laws themselves weren't fully repealed until the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which reclassified witchcraft as a crime of fraud, pretending to have powers, rather than a supernatural reality.
Yeah, the witch got me there, people. The witch. The witch got me. Huh? That would teach me. Huh? That would teach me.
Bluetooth mode.
Outro 002007042026 JTV.
In case you didn't know, being young is